How are you today? For those of you who are not from our booming metropolis of Cleveland, Ohio, I want to welcome you to what is the home of rock and roll. In the early 1950s, legendary radio DJ Alan Freed was the first person to say the words rock and roll on the radio airwaves, and it was also the home in March 1952, the home of the very first ever rock and roll concert, the Moondog Coronation Ball. It's also the home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I understand you're going to tonight, correct? Yes. It's just amazing to me that the home of rock and roll, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, is here, considering all rock and roll shows were banned from the city of Cleveland in the 1960s. We're going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to talk about the group that caused that ban. But before I do that, I'd like to start out with a question. I'm going to ask you all a question, and here's the deal. I don't want you to answer by a show of hands. I want you to answer by a round of applause, okay? Frankly, because I just like the way it sounds when I'm standing up here. So by a round of applause, how many of you are Beatles fans? Okay, good. All right, I'm going to ask a second question. This one's going to be a little bit harder, so pay attention. Not everybody is going to be able to answer this question. But by a round of applause, how many of you remember the 1960s when the Beatles were together, they were recording, they were touring? That's about the response I expected, because you know what they say, if you could remember the 1960s, you really weren't part of it. But it wasn't just the music about the Beatles. There was more to it than that. It was also their attitudes, but also the visuals. The visuals. When we saw the Beatles for the first time on the Ed Sullivan Show that Sunday night, we saw four guys in matching tightly tailored business suits. They had tight pants on. They also wore boots with high heels and pointy toes. They called them Beatle boots. And their hair. All right, their hair. No man had hair like that in 1964 except for Moe from the Three Stooges. And then that spring, it was announced that the Beatles were going to make their first tour of North America. And they released the early itinerary, the cities that were first on that list of the tour. And you know what? Cleveland, Ohio, the home of rock and roll, was nowhere on that list. Now, Cleveland in 1964 had two top 40 AM radio stations. So they went over here to Public Auditorium downtown Cleveland. It's also called Public Hall. Right now it's called the Convention Center right here downtown Cleveland. And they went in and said, look, we, WHK, want to sponsor the Beatles to bring them in for a concert in Cleveland. And they were told, no way. Not you guys. You're too small. We don't want to work with you guys. We want to work with KYW. They're the big one. We're waiting for them to come over. So they called up the Beatles booking agency in New York City. Said, we're WHK. We want to bring the Beatles to Cleveland. And they were told the same thing. No way, you guys are too small, we don't want to work with you, we're waiting for KYW. So they came up with this great rock and roll idea. In 1964, things are very different than they are now. Back then, the parents had no problems dropping their kids off downtown Cleveland or any other city to do what they wanted to do. Mom and Dad had no desire to see the Beatles. So they dropped their 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids off in front of Public Hall. Mom and Dad would go out to dinner, see a movie, go to a show, whatever they did, then come back and pick up their kids after the concert. So with 12,000 Beatlemaniacs in Public Hall, there was not much parental supervision going on in that arena. So when the Beatles came on stage, the police turned around to see what's the big deal. They didn't see behind them. All the kids were climbing over chairs, running down the aisles. Girls in the balcony had brought sheets. They tied them together. They were coming down like a siege out of the balcony. By the time the police realized what was going on, it was out of control. They could not stop the kids. So what they did is they ran up on stage and they stopped the concert. They pushed John Lennon and George Harrison away from the microphone and they stopped the concert. Now, instead of me telling you about this, I'm going to show it to you. The Beatles in Cleveland, 1964. Yeah, you can say the kids got a little bit out of hand. Now, the reason the Beatles and all rock and roll shows were banned from Cleveland is because the mayor, Ralph Locher, at that time said that is not the way little girls should behave in public. So rock and roll shows were banned. They did have one concert already signed to a contract they couldn't cancel. It came in about a month after this. It was the Rolling Stones. So they went over to City Hall. They talked to Mayor Ralph Locher. They talked to the city council, and they said, look, this has gotten out of hand. Beatlemania is so big. If you want to be a city on the map, you've got to bring the Beatles into Cleveland. It's like having a Major League Baseball team. It's like having an NFL team, bringing the Beatles to Cleveland. So they discussed it, and okay, they decided they're going to lift the ban. They will allow the Beatles and rock and roll shows back into Cleveland. But here's the deal. They told Norman Wayne and Joe Zingali, they said, you can bring the Beatles in, but you've got to rent Cleveland Municipal Stadium. Now, it's no longer there. The new Brown Stadium is built on top of where that was. It used to be called the Mistake on the Lake. I personally love the place, but it was old. And it was big. It was a big set, 86,000 people. It was the very first ever Monday night football game between the Cleveland Browns and the New York Jets was played in that stadium. But they said you have to rent the stadium, you have to put the Beatles in the middle on a stage on the second base of the Cleveland Indians infield, excuse me, and you cannot allow any fans on the field. They said, okay, we got a deal. What happened there was the same thing that happened at Public Hall on a much larger scale. August 14th, 1966, the Beatles in Cleveland. I want to thank you. You've been a fun crowd. I had a really good time.